Well, it is great to see all of you on this, blustery,
Great start there. Anyway,
snowy, wet evening out there, and to see a packed house. That is quite wonderful. And I have to say that having this conversation in a church feels weirdly appropriate because there is a moral urgency to what Paul Krugman has to say. One of his great gifts is the ability to distill the complicated and often esoteric ideas of economics into everyday language. If this really is the dismal science, he manages to make it not just intelligible, but vitally important. And of course, he also has plenty to say about politics, the media, and our current president. I think it's fair to say that Paul Krugman occupies a very distinct place in the firmament of public intellectuals. First of all, it's rare that a Nobel Prize winner has a regular column in a newspaper. For the past 2 decades, his twice-weekly New York Times column has been must-reading for his many fans and also for his critics. He's been called both the most hated and most admired columnist in the U.S., which means he's someone people really cannot ignore. And I might add that Donald Trump is one of those people. In fact, you may have heard that he recently called on the New York Times to fire Paul Krugman, which is a very odd thing for a president to do, I have to say.
it's a great honor.
It's a great honor. Paul Krugman's new book, Arguing with Zombies, is a collection of columns and essays going back more than 2 decades on all kinds of subjects, from Obamacare and Social Security to inequality and the real meaning of socialism, which I want to get into here. So we have a lot of ground to cover this evening. So without further ado, please welcome Paul Krugman.
Here. Wow.
So let's talk about zombies for a moment.
Yeah.
Because my image of a zombie is it is the undead creature who goes wandering around feasting on the brains of the living.
Yeah, and it turns out, so I stole the term. I saw it in a paper which was about myths about Canadian healthcare, kind of oddly, but typically American myths about Canadian healthcare, which is, millions of Canadians are coming here because they can't get care, and all of that, and it used the term zombie ideas. Those are ideas that have been proved false, and proved false repeatedly, should be dead, but they just keep on going. They just keep on shambling along, eating people's brains. And I've used the term ever since, because in fact, most of our policy discourse is not actually between, 2 ideas that reasonable people could hold, but between one idea that reasonable people do hold, and then a zombie idea that just refuses to die.
So what are some of those zombie ideas?
Okay. In U.S. politics, probably the one that has had the biggest influence is the belief that tax cuts for the rich are magical, so magical that they actually pay for themselves, which has never happened. It's been proved wrong again and again, but is now complete orthodoxy within the Republican Party. Probably the most deadly zombie out there is climate change denial. It's 60% of Republicans in Congress deny that climate change is happening, and just about all of the rest say there's nothing we can do about it. So that's a pretty big zombie there. But there's others too. So I can go on. The argument with zombies is basically structured as although it's columns over a long period of time plus some new material, it's structured as sort of, here's one zombie, here's another zombie. It's thematic, and it turns out as it turns out, I've written a number of columns about each of these because, after all, the zombies just keep shambling along. So you have to keep on trying to shoot them in the head again and again.
So why, if these are clearly wrong, why do these ideas persist year after year?
Most, not all, most of the zombies that are out there, you have to ask, in whose interest is it for people to believe in these things that are not true? So who benefits from the belief that cutting taxes on billionaires is a great idea? Well, that's kind of a self-answering question, and in fact, it's essentially kept alive by a whole network of media organizations, think tanks, and so on, who are ultimately funded by a relatively small number of very rich people. There have been some studies, some systematic studies. There are very few papers, very few scientists who deny climate change. And there's been a study, how many of those who do deny it have received funding from fossil fuel interests? And the answer is all, 100%. So mostly it's about money, although there are a few other zombies that are kept alive by, there are some other motives that do drive people.
So I want to, there are all kinds of subjects that I want to get into here, but before we do that, I want to just ask you a little bit about how you go about writing your New York Times column, and even more than that, what you consider to be the hallmark of a successful column.
Okay. So the first thing I think I probably should say is I worry a lot about whether anything is successful. I mean, one of the things, this is kind of a weird way to begin this discourse, but what, you know, I've had this enormous great fortune to have the best job in journalism. Nothing, you know, Times op-ed column. Nobody has that kind of exposure, that kind of reach, that kind of freedom, and your actual ability to move opinion, move events. It's very limited. So I'm not sure. At some level, nothing succeeds.
But can you chart? I mean, are there particular columns or particular subjects that you've came on that you feel like you really did shift the debate?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, me and a bunch of people. It's never individual. I think that there were a couple of places. There was a kind of a full court press of policy wonks pushing for healthcare reform. And obviously, if you want to ask, you know, who really deserves credit for Obamacare, the answer is clearly Nancy Pelosi. But I do think that wonks like me helped a little bit in that process. I think to some extent, we at least, I think people like me who opposed all of this really destructive austerity that was imposed after the financial crisis, at least mitigated, at least led some countries to back off on some of the destructive measures. But it's true that policy, you know, actually, you know, often I measure success more by the fact that I've managed to get some phrase out into there where it maybe in the end affects people's, the way people talk about a subject, rather than concrete policy results, because those are very few and far between.
So just a couple of nuts and bolts questions about how you do your column. How long does it take to write a typical column?
So that's actually not an easy question to answer, because I'm researching all the time. I spend a few hours a day on a variety of stuff. So I'm always accumulating stuff, you know, filing stuff away electronically, keeping track of issues, tweeting, because actually it turns out that now my Twitter feed is also kind of an archive for myself of things that I might want to come back to. Then I actually sit down to write, and it's fast. It's a couple of hours. That was an interesting question. I mean, I started out, I spent most of my adult life as an academic, and I was considered a very fast writer as an academic. The question was, how would I compare with journalists? And it turns out I'm fast by their standards too, and I have no idea why.
Do you ever get pushback from your editors, or do they say, sorry, we don't want that topic?
Well, there isn't time. I mean, the way the Times works is actually, it's very much it's a high wire act. I mean, filing deadline is 5 p.m., and the thing is usually posted online by 8 or 9. So there's really, I mean, there's very little. So I've never had them say, you know, this won't do, and I've had very little. I was given a bit of grief in the early 2000s over a subject that, fortunately, this book doesn't have to return to, which was the Iraq War. I was pretty much the only columnist on a major opinion page who said we're being lied into war, and the Times was scared and made it known to me that made them nervous.
So did they say you couldn't write those columns?
No, they just sort of made their concern known. I said, yeah, I understand your concern, but you know, if you want to replace me, go ahead. But and then it was interesting because at the end of 2003 was the first time that we actually got back some digital readings. At that point, the most emailed list And it turned out that I had 6 of the top 10 articles for the year, and suddenly I wasn't getting any more pressure from the Times over that.
So when I was doing a bit of research looking into your background, I was actually surprised to see, going back earlier in your career, that you seem to be more of a technocrat without any clear sort of political leanings. You actually worked for a year in the Reagan White House, right?
Yeah, so this is let me tell you, this is, so I was a technocrat in there. There was it was a non-political position, just sub-political level. I was the chief international economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. I was a registered Democrat, they knew that. The chief domestic economist was, what was his name? Summers, Larry Summers. Don't know what happened to him. But it was clear, yeah, I mean, I was much more of technically oriented, much less. I mean, it's partly just I have a different job now, right? What you do in an academic paper and what you do if you're writing a newspaper column.
But I'm guessing your politics have changed, or you're clearly more forthright now. And I guess I'm wondering what led to that change.
Okay, 2 things. First, the world changed. I mean, even now, people. One of the things that's happened, people now look back, or the way I sometimes put it is each successive Republican president has managed to make his predecessor look good. And people now look back at the Reagan White House as having been, conservative but reasonable. And I was there, and let me tell you, there were a lot of people in that administration who were not reasonable. But it wasn't the kind of hardline ideology. If the facts don't agree with our preconceptions, change the facts that we have now. So we are a very different country, a very different world from what we were then. So I think it's basically it's Stephen Colbert. The facts have a well-known liberal bias. So if you believe in facts and all of that, that automatically gives you a pretty strong political position. And then also different jobs. I mean, if you're writing an academic paper, that's one thing. If you're writing a newspaper column, about being loved, and if a column doesn't get a lot of people mad at you, then you've wasted the space. All right? You should be trying to get out there and be controversial enough, and not just for the sake of controversy, but you need to be taking a strong stand and not equivocate. So it's partly just a different. I mean, I was probably always. I was always a liberal. I have moved left some, partly because I think we've learned something. Some things I thought I knew. I have less faith in markets than I used to. I see more places where bigger government is essential. Oh, and I guess something I probably should have also mentioned is the other thing about America when I started my career. America was a middle-class society, did not have the kinds of extremes that we have now. So in a way, it becomes necessary to take a stand. Do you think that what's been happening to our society is okay or not?
So let's talk about the news, and let's talk about Bernie Sanders for a moment, the clear front runner in the Democratic race. And of course, he is causing all kinds of hand-wringing among the Democratic establishment. And one reason is because they are driven crazy by this idea that there's a socialist who might be leading the party. So, but the question is Bernie Sanders actually a socialist?
Yeah, and of course the answer is no. So there's a whole section of Arguing with Zombies called Eek Socialism, which was all about how the constant sort of 3-card Monte that right-wingers play, where you propose anything that might make people's lives better, and they say, "Oh, that's socialism." It's pretty literally. I mean, if you look at some, you say we should have universal child care, and they say, "Do you know how many people Stalin killed?" It's pretty much like that. And the point being that all these things. So people like me want to make that case that we can do a lot to improve people's lives. It's not the same. That's not socialism. Then you have a guy who is in fact pretty much what Europeans would call a social democrat. Bernie Sanders thinks that Denmark is a role model, which I agree. Denmark is a great role model, but he calls himself a socialist, which is just sort of some personal branding. Maybe it's a little bit of let's shock the bourgeoisie, but which is fine if you're just a senator, but is just offering like saying hit me. In a general election campaign. So I worry about it. I don't worry about his policy proposals. I worry that his distinctive personal branding is going to be a real problem.
So if he's not an actual socialist, what does socialism mean?
Socialism means that the government is trying to run the economy. Socialism is, government owning the means of production. It's seizing the commanding heights. It's the government trying to do command and control of stuff. I mean, Cuba is socialist. North Korea is socialist. Venezuela is more chaotic than anything else, but it's kind of socialist. But nobody in the United States, no significant group, advocates any of those things. The point is that when somebody in America says he's a socialist, somebody like Bernie Sanders or AOC, what they actually mean is they want universal health care and they want stronger labor unions and more aid for families. And those things are not, certainly, they bear no relationship to the kinds of things that people use the word socialism to mean when they're trying to scare you.
You mentioned that Bernie Sanders often holds up Denmark as a model.
Yeah.
I guess I do wonder, could the United States become Denmark?
Okay. Let me give you both sides of that. So sometimes people say, "Oh, look, Americans will never accept government-run health insurance." Except that every American over 65 has government health insurance, and another 80 million people have Medicaid. So we actually have a lot of that already. Or people say that America will never accept a situation where workers have really strong bargaining power, except we used to have a really strong union movement in this country. It's not fundamentally un-American. So a lot of the things that Denmark does, we do. We just don't do them on a sufficient scale. Now, what is true is that American politics, if you ask why is America different from every other advanced country, why are we're the only country that doesn't have universal health care, for example, every time you try to, it ends up coming back to the original sin of America. It ends up coming back to slavery and race. Because in Denmark still, people say, oh, when they talk about social programs, they think of it as being something that benefits people like themselves. And in America, a significant number of people think of it as being, that's money that you're taking my money and giving it to those people. And that's the reason. It's not our individualism or anything like that that makes it hard for us to be Denmark. It's our unpleasant racial history. But we have become better. We're, in spite of everything you see, we actually are a much more tolerant, much more open society than we used to be. I actually looked, you mentioned the Reagan administration, I've looked at polling data. Back in 1980, only a third of US whites thought that interracial marriage was okay. We've really changed a lot as a country. So maybe the possibility of us becoming more like Denmark is a lot stronger than it used to be.
So one of the underlying questions here is what government is good at doing and what government is not so good at doing. And I'm wondering where you draw the line there.
Okay, and the answer is that there's no hard and fast rule. There's certain things where it's very clear that government actually does a better job. Health insurance is one of them. It's not at all clear what private health insurance. It's interesting because I actually don't think that Medicare for all should be part of the Democratic platform because I think it's a very heavy political lift and there are other ways to get there. But there's no constructive role actually being played by private insurance companies here. It's just a question of it's hard to get from here to there. People talk, there are quite a few services that government can actually do better. there are still some places in America that have government-run power companies that work fine. The post office is actually, despite everything, is a pretty damn good institution. It's funny. You always say people talk about how hard. Do you want things to be like trying to deal with the DMV? Now I think that varies a lot by place, but my experiences at the Department of Motor Vehicles have always been pretty positive, actually. And on the other hand, you weren't back there, but we have somebody who's house sitting at the moment for us, and the internet went out. And let me tell you, I would rather deal with the DMV 10 times than deal with Verizon.
I can attest to this. When we were backstage, Paul was madly texting, trying to help out with this Verizon problem.
Yeah. So I've done some back of the envelope stuff of the things. We've tried having government run steel mills, and that has not worked out well. We've tried having government. You don't want government doing the government run shops, but certainly basic insurance functions. A lot of basic public services, government can do well. Actually, I had an experience. I've now moved from, but Princeton. We had this weird, too much. What you don't want to, but as it happened in Princeton Township, we shifted from private garbage collection to finally having the town do it, and it's a whole lot better.
What about Social Security?
Oh, Social Security is. That was, by the way, the book starts with Social Security. Social Security is one of the it was where post-Iraq it was the next thing that I spent a lot of time on, and for once the first time that my side actually won, which was don't privatize this thing, and Social Security is a really good system. It maybe should be more generous, as it turns out, but it's very efficient. Administrative costs are minimal, fraud is minimal, and it provides a bedrock of security. And this is one of those things, I think this is, in general, I'm a little skeptical of people who say, oh, elites just don't get how ordinary Americans live. But that whole debate saying, well, we should make Social Security more like a 401k, that was affluent, white-collar types in the news media and elsewhere, having no idea what life is like for most Americans. The fact of the matter is, for most Americans, Social Security is the majority of what they live on in retirement, and for about a third of older Americans, it's basically everything they have in retirement. This is the bedrock, and thank God we have that program. If we had privatized it, yeah.
Will Social Security run out of money?
Well, Social Security, it's a peculiar set. FDR did something that was clever when he set it up. Maybe in the very long run, maybe a little bit too clever. So it's a government program that is designed to create the facade of looking like a private pension fund, which it really isn't. So it's a program. There's a dedicated tax, the payroll tax, that pays for retiree benefits, and the system, for a while there, accumulated a bunch of excess money in anticipation of the retirement of the baby boomers. And that excess money will be drawn down they keep shifting, but 15, 20 years, at which point the revenue coming in from the payroll tax will be insufficient to pay benefits in full. Not zero. Even if you just did nothing, we'd still be paying about 3/4 of what we're now paying in Social Security benefits. But that's not going to happen. The reality is it's just a government program supported by taxes. And if the current tax that supports it turns out to be insufficient, we can raise money either by increasing that tax or getting other taxes. The question is, can America actually afford to provide decent retirement for its citizens? The answer is yes, of course we can, even with an aging population. So something will have to happen. There will be an action-forcing event, as they sometimes say in Washington. It will be necessary for Congress to pass some law to augment Social Security's finances at some point in the future. But it's not any kind of crisis in the sense that terrible things are about to happen.
One of the big ideas that we keep hearing during this Democratic presidential campaign is the so-called wealth tax. And I'm wondering if you could explain how this would work.
Well, I mean, actually, it's been a while since I sat down with the numbers, but let's just say the idea. So we have income taxes, which are we all understand, and we actually tax certain kinds of wealth. The real estate tax, property taxes are the basis of a lot of local government, but we do tax some wealth at death. So we have an inheritance tax, or actually we have an estate tax, which is, but a lot of wealth manages to bypass that. So a lot of accumulated capital income never gets taxed, actually. And the idea of a wealth tax is that we should try to collect some money on the very large fortunes that some people have accumulated. And so the Warren and I guess now the Sanders wealth taxes, would they kick in at a very high level, something like estates in excess of $50 million would have to pay 1 or 2% on the value in excess of $50 million. So this the vast majority of Americans would see nothing. And you might think there can't possibly be that can't possibly raise a significant amount of money, except it turns out that in 21st century America, the rich are so rich that it really could raise a significant amount of money. So that's the idea, and it's the people who put this together. The Warren proposal was actually devised by the two smartest young finance people in the world, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman. So this is serious stuff. I mean, we can argue that the big question there is not actually whether it's justified, not whether it would do any harm, because I haven't seen any serious arguments that it would do any economic harm. The question is, how easy would it be for wealthy people to evade it? And that's where there's a good dispute about that.
Let's talk about climate change. You have said, and I'm quoting here, to be honest, sometimes I wonder whether I'm wasting my time talking about any issue other than climate change. And I know a lot of people share that sentiment, and as a media person myself, I'm confronted with this, how often can I talk about climate change on my radio show? You can't really do it week after week. And how do you approach that with your column?
Yeah, that's the thing. You have to, on the one hand, it's at some level it's the only. Let's put that if we don't deal with it, then nothing else matters. It is really existential. It's a civilization-ending threat. But on the other hand, it's people will tune you out if you only write about the same thing again and again. And you have to, one thing I do, I quote, I quote him in the book, Raymond Chandler, of all people, the detective novelist, wrote an essay about how to write. And he said other things equal. He sounded like an economist there. Other things equal, the more important the subject, the more interesting the work, but often other things are not equal. There have been some very dull books written about God and some very good books written about making a living while staying fairly honest. And so to some extent you need to leaven the climate doom, despite the fact that that is the most important issue, with other stuff. And also as a political matter, however appalling the climate prospects are, we're not actually going to be able to get the kind of political action we need unless you can sell it as part of a broader agenda. It has to be climate change plus public investment plus jobs. It has to be, I like the green, nobody knows quite what the Green New Deal means, which is a great advantage. You want it to be a bunch of stuff. You want it to be a package of things which includes saving the planet.
But is it too much? I mean, that's the accusation against the Green New Deal, is that it's sort of, it's so all-encompassing, it's just unrealistic.
Well, but I think that something more limited mean, you start fairly ambitious, but the idea, we need a whole lot of public investment in many areas. Let's put it this way, I have colleagues, people who are not zombies, who think that we should be just intensely focused on a carbon tax. There's actually a letter signed by like 5,000 economists, including every living former Federal Reserve chairman and so on, that calls for a carbon tax and redistributing the proceeds as a dividend to the public, which they think is politically possible. And I think they're dreaming, that people think that that's not how people think. You say it's all spinach and no dessert. It's a tax, and even if you tell people they're going to get money back, it's not going to sell it. And so you need to mix in a bunch of other stuff. Now, if you, and also I think the economics, it turns out, the idea that just giving the private sector the right incentives with terms of pricing carbon is the be-all and end-all, turns out to be wrong. It turns out, look, we've had a technological miracle in green technology. I'm old enough to remember when solar power was hippie nonsense. And now solar power is cheaper than coal. And if you ask, how did that happen? How did renewables get so cheap? A lot of it has to do with the investments in green energy that the Obama administration made as part of the stimulus plan back in 2009. So it turns out that government investment, a little bit of industrial policy has to be an important part of the mix as well. And then if you can also say, look, we're going to be creating jobs, we're going to be spending, we might actually fix some potholes while we're at it. That's a much better prospect of getting stuff done.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of press you a little bit more on this. Suppose a Democrat wins the presidency. You are the new economic czar. It's up to you to come up with a blueprint specifically to deal with climate change. What would you do, and how far could that actually take us to fixing this problem?
Okay, so it would be a mix. The first thing I do is actually get some people who actually understand the technology in, which is kind of an important thing that lately politicians have stopped doing. But my understanding is that we can do, so first of all, yes, we do need to ramp our way up to putting some price on emissions. People now have no financial incentive to limit emissions. You need to have investment. Partly, further developing the technologies. Partly, there's a lot of network effects. I mean, a lot of the way that we're going to move to a sustainable economy is electrifying things, and those depend. One big problem with having electric vehicles is that there are gas stations everywhere. There aren't charging stations everywhere. That sort of thing. So you invest in that sort of thing, and then you. Basically, I think you try as far as possible. Oh, and you have to so far as possible, offer compensation for the people who will be on the losing end. I mean, you can't insulate people totally from change. It happens all the time, and but yeah, we can do something for people. There will be some jobs lost in fossil fuels. There aren't very many coal miners left, but the ones who are certainly deserve some kind of compensation package. So it would be very. There's a phrase people talk about Christmas tree legislation, which is full of gifts. There's a little gift for everybody. Climate change legislation should be a Christmas tree. That's the way to get it through, and I would try to probably actually consult as far as possible with relevant interest groups to say, what shiny baubles can we give you to get you to sign on to saving the planet.
So suppose that the U.S. would miraculously suddenly sort of get into the game of trying to confront climate change, and and Europe is also pushing in that direction. There are still other countries, most notably China, which doesn't seem to be doing anything.
Actually, the Chinese are doing more than people think, but they're also still building some coal plants. But carbon tariffs, you tax imports based upon the emissions that are associated with producing those goods, and there's there's a question, is that legal under international trade law? I think it is, as best I can tell, but if it isn't, so much for international trade law. You know, this is much more important. But the fact of the matter is there'd actually be a very strong incentive if the major advanced countries get serious about addressing climate change. There'll be a really strong incentive for other countries to sign on as well, because otherwise they'll find themselves excluded from our markets. I don't think this is really most of the pieces are in place to do this, and it's really just the United States. If the United States were to take a real leadership role here, I think we might be astonished at how quickly. And remember, technology is our friend. Renewable energy has made incredible strides. It has never looked easier to go to a really low emissions economy than it does now.
So I have a couple of more explicitly political questions before we go to the questions from our audience. When we go back to the first campaign that Bill Clinton ran, his campaign manager, James Carville, famously said, "The economy's stupid," and the idea was that the voters voted on the basis of how the economy was doing. And I guess I'm wondering if that's really true, because it seems like you could make a very compelling argument that actually the current political divide has more to do with cultural identity than economics.
Yeah. Partly is that, you know, we have changed. So political scientists used to talk a lot about these very simple statistical models that seem to predict presidential election outcomes based largely on the state of the economy. Actually, not so much the state of the economy as on how rapidly the economy was growing in the year before the election. But those things rely a lot on historical data, and we are not the same country we were. The relationships seem to have gotten a lot weaker over time because there aren't that many swing voters in America now, and people have pretty strong views and are driven by cultural stuff. So yeah, the economy matters some, and if you were in think about 1992. Which is when Carville said that. That was an election between George H.W. Bush, who was conservative but kind of a reasonable guy, and Bill Clinton, who was mildly liberal but kind of a reasonable guy. And it made sense that that election would hinge upon who you thought was going to be a better economic manager. That's not the kind of election we're about to have.
Okay, so one final question before I go to the audience questions. What will it take to defeat Donald Trump in November?
Oh, the answer is I have no idea. No, I mean, the main thing I think is that I hope that people. Let me tell you, actually, what really makes me angry. I don't actually usually get angry at the people who promulgate zombie ideas or any of this stuff. I don't get angry at the people I think are destroying the planet. They just are who they are, and I get angry at people who are self-indulgent, people who sort of share my political values, but are prepared to prioritize their own egos or their own whatever, their sense of personal gratification over the fate of the country and the world. And so what's going to be really important is that whoever the Democrats nominate, that everybody set that aside. That we don't have billionaires saying, oh, well, you know, Trump is terrible, but gee, Bernie Sanders might raise my taxes. It's much more important to keep America, you know, democratic, a democracy, not democratic. You know, freedom is more important than your tax rate. Or that if it isn't Bernie Sanders, that there will be Sanders supporters who will say, oh, I am not going to vote for an establishment Democrat. Again, you know, don't go that way. And I have to say, the thing that has been disturbing watching the Democratic primary is how much you know, ego, self-aggrandizement, pettiness you still seem to see. So all that has to go away. There has to be, people have to focus on the importance. This could be our last real election. And I hope that people will remember that.
Okay. So actually, I have some questions that were submitted to us in advance, and so we've picked out several questions, and I'm going to go ahead and read them. So, first question from our audience: goes like this: Our politicians on both sides seem to adjust their view on whether the national debt is critically important, such that it often looks as though they are playing the economy for their short-term political benefit. How much does our national debt matter, and why?
So first of all, let me say I disagree with the first part of that statement. It's not really the case. Republicans did a complete 180. You know, debt was an existential threat as long as there was a Democrat in the White House, and suddenly they don't care at all.
And Mick Mulvaney just said this last week, right?
Yeah, right. They've more or less admitted it. Yeah, saying the quiet parts out loud. You haven't seen anything like that on the Democratic side. They haven't suddenly started. You didn't see Democrats start wailing about the utterly disastrous impact of. They complain a bit about the Trump deficits, but it's nothing like that. So this is not really a both sides story. It's not politicians. It's Republicans, right? People often say, you know, partisans do, and when you actually try to ask who they're talking about, they're really just talking about one party. The parties are very, you know, not the Democrats are saints, but they're just very different. It's not the same kind of thing. Now, how important is national debt? And the answer is not very important. And it's one of the funny things is that people, actually, at the previous event on this book tour, I had somebody saying, you know, somebody or other is saying that national debt isn't that important. How do you reconcile that with the things that people like Larry Summers say? Well, what Larry Summers is saying right now is that national debt is not very important.
Why isn't it important? Isn't there a big problem with running up a huge deficit?
Really not. I mean, it's not something that you can totally ignore. But first of all, the idea that when we borrow, that we're stealing from our children, you've got to remember that debt. Keep on saying this, which seems to me is obviously true, and it drives people crazy. But you know, debt is money we owe to ourselves. Debt is just a claim of one group of people on another group of people. From the point of view of the planet as a whole, the amount of debt out there is not a burden that's going to be paid by future generations. Or put it this way, the beneficiaries are alive. It's just a claim of one part of society on another. And so the idea that we're impoverishing ourselves by running up debt is wrong. And the idea that we are facing some kind of a debt crisis of runaway debt is really also wrong. I mean, the U.S. government, I don't even know what the number is today, but in recent weeks, the U.S. government has been able to borrow long-term at an interest rate of 1.5%. At that interest rate, remember, nobody cares about what the absolute number is on debt. You only care about the ratio to the size of the economy, the debt to GDP ratio. You know, how did we pay off the debt from World War II? We didn't. We never did. What happened was that the U.S. economy grew and the debt from World War II became insignificant relative to the size of the economy. And with the U.S. economy growing, roughly 2% real growth plus 2% inflation, actually debt melts away relative to GDP faster than the interest payments on debt. When people worry about a debt spiral, actually we're not in debt spiral territory, and haven't been. Last year, the president of the American Economic Association, former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, gave his presidential address to say, you know, this whole debt spiral thing is nonsense and has always been nonsense. There are a few years in the 1980s when the interest rate was higher than the growth rate, but it really never happened. So it just is not. And then if you ask, well, but won't people get scared and refuse to lend to the U.S. government? Well, Japan has debt that is well over twice as high relative to the size of its economy as ours. And the Japanese interest rate is negative. People are actually paying the Japanese government to take their money. So nothing out there in the numbers suggests that debt is an important problem. It just, I mean, I would not particularly want to see debt go to 300% of GDP. It's under 100 right now. But I can't, if I was to make a list of the top 10 things to worry about for the United States, debt would not make that list.
Next question from Steve Freed, who says, in my econ class, we cover different economic schools of thought, such as the classical, neoclassical, developmental, etc. Which school do you belong to and why?
Oh, this is not actually how it's supposed to work, right? I mean, economics, you know, we're trying to be a science here, right? And it's a pretty imperfect science, but you try your best to just figure out how the world works. I mean, we don't teach schools of thought in physics. No, economics is a whole lot harder than physics, and there's much more room for legitimate. It is, you know.
Well, I've seen you described as a Keynesian.
Well, no, but Keynesianism is definitely a view about how business cycles work. But first of all, it's just one piece of economics. But the thing about Keynesianism, the basic ideas of Keynesianism is, I guess it's a school of thought, but it also happens to be the truth. And you know, which we've seen overwhelmingly confirmed. This past decade has been an incredibly coming into this. If you go back 10 years ago, there were a lot of practical people who were men of affairs, who were sure that budget deficits would lead to skyrocketing interest rates, and that the Fed's efforts to rescue the economy would lead to hyperinflation and all of that stuff. And people who had actually understood Keynesian economics said, no, not under these conditions. In these conditions, none of that's going to happen. And furthermore, if you try to do austerity measures, they're going to shrink the economy. And the Keynesians have been right every step of the way. So, you know, how many successful predictions do you have to make before something stops being just one among many schools of thought and, in fact, a validated economic theory? Sorry.
Next question from Jake Kowalski. What should cities do to create economic and employment opportunities in historically under-resourced communities that are proven to be effective, sustainable, and won't cause displacement via gentrification?
Oh, boy. All right. So first of all, so that's, by the way, probably very few people know that one of my original core academic fields was economic geography. I sort of did a lot of work on why do regions sometimes converge and sometimes diverge, and it's interesting because when I wrote it, I did that work, most of it 30 years ago, regions were converging. Incomes were becoming more similar across parts of the United States and all, and then we started diverging again, and now we have a real problem of left behind parts of America, and the question of how do you revive the regions that are being left behind is actually a really hard one. It's not clear that there are any very good answers to that. I mean, I'd like to use when Amazon was soliciting bids for its second headquarters. It said right away, you know, don't even bother talking to us unless you have at least 1 million people and a highly educated workforce. That's the kind of places we want to locate. That's what the modern economy wants. And very, very hard to get modern economic, progressive industries to move to places that don't already have a lot of economic strengths. And you can find isolated examples of successful communities, but they tend to be pretty isolated and random events. It's a college town, or there's just some. I spent the first 8 years of my life living in Utica, New York, which has even worse weather than here. And it turns out I was doing some, what's happening in Utica is actually doing better than some of the neighboring towns because it's the headquarters of Chobani Yogurt. And you ask why, and the answer is actually because they accepted some Bosnian Muslim refugees in the mid-1990s who knew about yogurt. But that's a random sort of, it's very hard to do that on any sort of systematic basis. So the answer is not clear. And on the gentrification, there's one thing where I will say where where blue states do it wrong, which is NIMBYism, restriction on housing construction, is really destructive. I mean, in many, many ways, California is a state where finally progressives can be progressives, and they've done wonders in terms of improving health insurance coverage and so on, but they still won't let people build housing. And so housing is wildly unaffordable. And the answer is, now, gentrification, it's going to happen that neighborhoods become trendy. And it's probably, it's hard to fight that, but if you take the broader view, as long as the city allows, and to some extent encourages, you should also have programs to provide affordable housing, but that's how you do it. The way to make sure the city remains affordable for ordinary people is to make sure that it builds enough housing for ordinary people.
Last question from the audience. This is from Henry Luo. Why do you think new policies that have potential, such as a value-added tax and universal basic income, are not discussed more often in public discourse? Most European countries have adopted value-added tax because it's harder for corporations to avoid. Milton Friedman advocated for a negative income tax in the 1960s to end poverty. Okay.
Value-added tax, which is really kind of a universal sales tax. The trouble is it is a little bit regressive. It tends to fall more heavily on poorer people because they spend a higher share of their income. That's okay if it's used to finance strongly progressive social programs. So Denmark has a value-added tax, and the Danish tax system isn't all that progressive, but combine the tax system with the social programs, and it's hugely progressive. So, for the United States, if we could do a value-added tax, if you can convince people that we need a greatly expanded social programs, and that would be one way to pay for them. But it is a hard thing to sell because people would see it as correctly as raising their cost of living. You have to convince them that they're getting enough out of it. Universal basic income that's an interesting one because I like the idea. I forgot to say in my encomiums to Social Security, one of the great things about Social Security is that it's not intrusive. Social Security Administration doesn't ask you to prove that you need it. It just comes, and they don't, and that's that's a liberating thing, and it's good for dignity, and something like a universal basic income would do that. The trouble is that in order for UBI, once someone said, YHTMAAAIYP, which you would write on papers, which was you have too many acronyms and abbreviations in your paper. Anyway, the universal basic income, the trouble is that it's either the proposals that are out there right now are just not enough to live on. And if you wanted to make it to be enough for people to actually live on, then you'd have to raise a lot of money. So you'd have to have a big increase in taxes to pay for it. And so given where we are right now, I think we need to continue to rely on needs-based programs, things like food stamps and Medicaid and various other programs that target people who are really in need of aid, because otherwise it's not going to be remotely adequate. Now, if there comes a time when the robots are taking all the jobs, then I'm willing to reconsider, because that may be the only thing we can do. But that's the Andrew Yang thing. But there's actually no evidence that that's happening. So there's
no evidence that the robots are taking our jobs?
Productivity, I mean, there are always robots taking some jobs somewhere, but that's not happening any faster now than in the past. People like people in the sort of educated elite see computer stuff and say, "Oh, that's revolutionary," but they kind of didn't pay attention when giant cranes eliminated hundreds of thousands of jobs for longshoremen, or when mountaintop removal eliminated hundreds of thousands of mining jobs. Things like this have always been happening. They're not happening any more rapidly now than in the past. So at the moment, things like universal basic income it's a basically unaffordable solution to a non-existent problem. And I'm be much more focused. Right now, let's focus on universal child care and actually getting to universal health care one way or another, getting to the 20 million people that Obamacare didn't reach, and UBI, come back to it if there comes a point when the robots really do take all our jobs and they don't decide to kill us all. That's when we do it.
So I have one final question, which is kind of a follow-up to what you're just saying. The experts all seem to say that the economy is very good right now. It's kind of roaring along. And yet, when I talk to people I know, they're struggling. So I guess, is the economy really good, or do we have a very skewed idea of how we define what is a good economy?
Well, employment is high. The unemployment rate is very low, although that's, for reasons that we don't fully understand, that seems to be tracking other measures of employment less well. But even things that, I look a lot at prime age employment, what fraction of people in prime working years are actually employed, and that has only recently gotten back to levels historically associated with full employment, but it's okay. But what's not okay is wages. We have really still seen very, very modest wage growth, and there's really interesting work I've been looking at, that in some ways, even when we look at purchasing power, we're kind of missing that. I'm about to go off on a long discourse, so let me not say that. If people's perception is that it's really, really hard to have a middle-class existence on the jobs that are currently available, that perception is correct. And that has not gone away. So this may be we may have the lowest unemployment rate we've had for a few decades, but we're actually a lot further from being a society in which people could count on feeling like they had a middle-class lifestyle than we were in, say, in the 1990s. And that's the reality. And if your numbers tell you something different, numbers, if numbers collide with people's sense of what's really happening, then there's something wrong with the numbers. And I think that, 3.5% unemployment is great, but a lot is still lacking.
So, on that sobering note, we are out of time. I want to thank all of you for coming, and especially thanks to you, Paul Krugman.
Thank you.